Welcome to the Inner West Library Speaker Series. Before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today, we'll be talking to Katherine Firkin about what it's like to be a debut author and journalist in the time of COVID-19 and how she is navigating this difficult time, as well as her new publication, Sticks and Stones. Katherine Firkin is a Melbourne journalist currently with CBS New York. She has over a decade of experience and has worked across every medium: print, online, television, and radio. Sticks and Stones is a gritty and thrilling read set amidst inner city Melbourne and is inspired by the countless criminal trials she has covered as a crime and court reporter and the unbelievably graphic details that often went unreported outside of the courtroom. Welcome, Katherine.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. My first question, Katherine. Congratulations on your debut novel, Sticks and Stones, Australian crime at its best. Katherine, you have a remarkable way of writing. I can visualise everything as I read, a bit like watching a television show with so many interesting narratives and multiple plot threads. Can you explain your style?
Yeah, well, I must admit, I've chosen a slightly different style for Sticks and Stones, and a lot of people have described it the way you have, that it almost reads a little bit like a TV series. I must admit, I didn't deliberately intend to make it that way, but I certainly did want to write from multiple perspectives and to have really quite short, sharp changes of scene, really as a way to keep people engaged and to keep people turning the page, but also as a way to really get inside the heads of my different characters. There are quite a few different characters in this book, and it really was important to me that people would become very invested in them and that they would also feel like they really got to know these people through the book.
I was surely invested, I can tell you that now.
Oh, that's great feedback. Yeah, so far people seem to really love this style, even though, as you mentioned, it is a little bit different and perhaps it might take people sort of a page or two to sort of understand how it's going to read.
You had so many characters and they were all so interesting. As an author, do you find one that becomes your favorite? If yes, who was it and why?
Well, I must admit, I become really invested in all my characters as I get writing. One of the characters I was particularly invested was actually, one of the less prominent characters to start with, and that was a teenage boy named Samir who lived in the Flemington Commission flats. And I guess I just felt sort of this mixture of empathy and also like I wanted to help this kid out a bit because he's a little bit on the wrong path, but he's not necessarily a bad person at heart when you first meet him. So I did certainly become extremely attached to him. And I also surprisingly really enjoyed writing from the perspective of the offender himself. Obviously, I can't say too much. I don't want to give anything away, but I really enjoyed having that liberty and that freedom to really push the boundaries of human behavior and human motivation in a way that really you only can do when you're dealing with a character as evil as a killer.
Yes, the ending did get me by surprise. I can tell you that now, but we're not about to say our the little secret that happens at the end, are we?
No, let's not ruin it for everyone, but I'm so glad to hear that it was a bit of a twist at the end. That's good.
Detective Emmett Corbin. Very interesting detective. Will he be back? Do you have any plans for a series?
Yeah, I'm glad you described him as interesting. It's funny. I made a little bit of a different choice with my detective. Quite often at the moment in crime novels, the lead protagonist is a little bit damaged or they have a bit of a, traumatized backstory or they're avenging something that's happened in the past. And I went a little bit different with my lead detective. He's actually quite a straight-laced, hardworking, genuinely seriously invested in his job kind of a policeman. And I'm really glad that people so far do seem to be loving him because I wanted to have someone that reflected the sort of detectives I see out on the road as a reporter day after day. And certainly my intention when I wrote Sticks and Stones was that this would be a series. And in fact, I have almost finished what I believe will be the second book in this series, and I'm pretty excited about that.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you reveal the title at least, or you're not about to?
I probably can't tell you the title, but I can tell you that it will be Detective Emmett Corbin back, and he'll be investigating a cold case back from 1991, which involves three teenage girls who go out one evening and only two of them return.
Well, I'll be looking forward for that book. I can tell you that now. You've got me. That's for sure.
That's great feedback.
Catherine, how have you been coping during self isolation? I assume you've been working from home?
Most of my work has been from home, yes. I have been doing a little bit of reporting, which still involves me getting out of the house and actually having to do some TV work and things. But they are all the media organisations are trying to get people to work from home as much as possible. Obviously, I'm used to sort of being alone and sitting in a computer by myself with my writing anyway. So I haven't found it too difficult, but it's more just that uncertainty that I'm sure a lot of people are dealing with, and that sort of general anxiety that's around at the moment, that we just really don't know when all this is going to end and how it's going to play out, and how we're going to be affected at the end of it all.
Yes, I agree with you there. I really do. I really do. Catherine, you've covered some of Victoria's biggest criminal trials. Are there any that particularly motivated you to write Sticks and Stones?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I'll start by saying obviously my book is fiction, so it's not, directly related to any one case that I've covered, but there certainly are a few cases that really stood out in my mind when I was reflecting on what I've done so far in my career as a journalist. One of those was the 2014 murder of Renee Lau, and in my mind, this is still one of the most horrific murders that Melbourne has ever seen. And it was a case that really, I don't think, got enough attention or enough notoriety at the time. Renee was a pastry chef who had come over from Hong Kong and was living in Melbourne. And from all accounts, she was effectively living the life of her dreams. She'd been volunteering at an aged care home, and she'd been singing at a local choir, and she'd just met this great guy. And a man quite literally grabbed her and dragged her off the street as she was walking to work one morning, and brutally raped and murdered her in an attack that lasted over 80 minutes. And she was conscious for most of that attack. And I will never forget sitting in the courtroom and hearing the details of what happened to her, and looking across at the offender, who showed absolutely no remorse and had absolutely no motivation for doing it. It was completely random, and it was so brutal. And it made me start to really question, how does someone end up at that point where they're able to do something like that? And in this particular case, what was also extremely striking about it was that this man had almost no history of prior offending. And so I really did start to look back into who this person was and how did they get to this point. And what I discovered was that he had a fairly unstable, if not traumatized, childhood. And this is something that I found repeated itself almost continuously when I started looking at offenders. And that is a theme that's in Sticks and Stones, that you do see a backstory of the offender, and you do get a much larger picture of who they are and where they've come from than I think you do in many crime books.
It's quite scary, actually, isn't it? A
Yeah,
bit
it's
scary.
it's it is scary, and it bothers me that these people probably, are not necessarily born evil. I mean, perhaps they are. There's always that nature versus nurture debate, but I really don't think there are many people, if there are any at all, who are purely born evil and are just sort of destined to do evil things. I think there are a lot of people who do fall through the cracks and who make terrible personal choices and decisions, and who probably are let down by society in one way or another, and don't perhaps have the skills to get themselves back on the right track.
Hmm. Oh dear. Catherine, one of the central themes in the book is the backstory of the offender. Why did you choose to focus on this? Is this something you've experienced in the courtroom?
Yeah, absolutely. As I was just talking about, it really is something that I find repeats itself over and over again, that when you get to the sentencing part of almost any trial, even not the most serious trials, that you find that the offender has had some sort of neglect or damage or unstable childhood or has really fallen in with the wrong crowd and not been able to get out of that situation. I even see it with, offenders who maybe have stolen cars or who have, robbed places. We're not even talking about in the absolute most extreme cases of offending. And so it was something for me that was important. I would never, ever obviously sympathise with offenders or condone what they are doing, but I think it's an important part of the conversation that we don't perhaps have often enough, is that these people are still whole people. They're not just evil offenders. And it's an interesting sort of thought to look back at how they got to this point. And of course, in the real world, I ideally would be able to actually intervene and recognise when people are really going off the path in this way.
Yeah. Gee, it's hard to reply back to that, what you just said. It really is, but I can understand.
It's a bit confronting, and it's certainly something that I find in court. It's a bit confronting, and it's also, to be honest, it's a little bit almost depressing because you see this cycle of neglect repeat itself over and over and over. And I really do find that damage in the past creates damage in the future, and it's like this domino effect. And I do hope from a personal point of view, I hope that we can sort of find better ways to intervene earlier so that people are not falling through the gaps as often as they are. And of course, a large part of that's going to be education and making sure that children particularly are kept, in supportive, stable environments, which is not always possible. But I do think perhaps we're getting a little better at least at identifying vulnerable people.
Yeah, I agree with you there, and it's also good that the media does cover it and journalists like you do the stories because it just gets the word out there and people, know what's going on, rather than just keeping things hush hush.
Yeah, I think that transparency is really important, and I think that's what I really enjoyed about writing Sticks and Stones was that I had so much more time and space in 100,000 words to actually really explore some of these themes, and also do it in a way that was still, for want of a better word, still entertaining, so that people will want to read and keep going and sort of know how things turn out.
Well, it was entertaining. I mean, there is a difference between the true crime and, of course, fiction crime, but people enjoy true crime as well. And people in our inner west libraries, they absolutely love anything crime. They love the crime fiction, true stories, everything. So it's one of the most popular genres that we have here.
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting genre to write in because, as I mentioned before, you do have so much freedom to really explore with human psychology and human motivation and behavior. And I find those areas really fascinating. And I think for a lot of people, the reason we are so excited by crime is not because we're glorifying it or celebrating it by any means, but for most people, these behaviors are so far outside of what they could do themselves that there is this sort of almost like you get a bit of a peek behind the curtain at this other life that does go on all around us. And it does impact so many people in one way or another. And then, of course, there's also just the actual fun of, the mystery and trying to solve, almost like solving a puzzle, really. And certainly my book, I did try to keep it fun. And I also really did try to keep the suspense up so that hopefully people are attempting to solve it and they have all the clues to solve it, but perhaps, it might be intricate enough that they don't quite get there.
Well, it's funny that you say that because it was suspenseful for me too because I had a PDF version of your book because we couldn't get a hold of the hard copy quick enough, and I had it on my laptop at home, and I had it all nice and big, and I was just reading through it, and I was just devouring it. So it was great. I've said I've enjoyed it before, and I really did enjoy it immensely.
Oh, that's great to hear. And I love the fact that you've raced through it. That's good feedback.
A bit too fast, I think. They can wait for lunch. Make yourself a sandwich. They can wait for lunch. Catherine, what does life look like while using new technology with the confines of your home?
Yeah, it's interesting. I must admit, I'm a little bit scared of technology generally, and people are often surprised by that because I do work in the media and I work in broadcast media, so I'm on TV all the time. But that doesn't mean that I'm actually the one, pushing the buttons or fixing the cables or, my job's quite simple. All I have to do is stand there and talk, and I'm not very good actually at, the sort of technological side of things myself. So this period has been really a little bit daunting for me, and particularly when I realized that my entire book launch and my whole sort of effectively tour was going to be online, I had a little bit of a panic because I thought, I've never done podcasts before. I've never done blogs. I've never, done live YouTube and Facebook streaming and everything else that I've suddenly done. So in a way, I've actually learned a whole lot of new skills, which I would not have otherwise learned, because I try to avoid technology as much as possible because we just don't seem to get on. But it's been interesting. And one thing that has surprised me, because I really love face-to-face contact, I like to chat to people and hear their side of the story. I've been really impressed with how adaptable people are at, still engaging through these different mediums, and how you still can feel like you create a little community around yourself, even if it can't actually be in person. It's actually been quite pleasing to see that.
I find we're all in the same boat there because everything's all new to us as well. It's been a learning curve for quite a lot of us, learning all new technologies. So you're not alone there. I could tell you that now.
Oh, that's good to hear. Yeah, I'm always a bit embarrassed to admit that I'm terrible with technology, because people just assume that I must know what I'm doing, and I really don't.
We can pretend, and we've gone
Yes.
this far, so we're doing all right,
Yes.
aren't we? Catherine, I'm aware that you've worked in a range of medium. How do you think media has been influenced by the pandemic?
Well, there's no doubt that media's been hit hard, but so have a lot of industries. From a financial point of view, of course, there's not much advertising happening at the moment in any mediums, and so we have been seeing redundancies and unfortunately job losses across the board in media, and not just in Australia, right across the world. But I actually think media was quite unstable before this anyway. It's been a real challenge for media outlets to adapt to the new world and to technologies, and to the fact that everyone now pretty much has a smartphone, and they can, live stream, and they can take photos, and they can blog, and they can effectively be journalists themselves. And I really don't think the media has done enough to separate themselves as sort of being the experts, as opposed to just sort of everyone else running around, with their own gear. So I do think in a way they probably need a bit of a wake up call. And certainly, I mean, as far as, job losses, there's been plenty of industries that have been hurt just as badly. And of course, as far as the actual day to day work goes, most of us are trying to work from home, although in this job, it's not always possible. You do have to actually go to some events to report on them, but we're doing what we can to, keep socially distancing just like everyone else.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I do hope the it gets better for all the people that have lost their jobs. So we'll look forward to the future, see what's going to happen. It'll take a little while before we pick up again, but I'm sure it will.
I mean, there's lots of industries and lots of different people who've been affected in really different ways. So I certainly don't feel like we're any worse than anyone else. It's just a funny time, because in some ways people need the media now more than ever, and yet the revenue and the ability of us to function is lower than ever. So it's an interesting sort of conflict
Mm,
that we're all trying to face.
yes, yeah, I hear you. Will you continue writing fiction? If yes, what other formats will you be using in the future when the new normal occurs?
Yes, I'll definitely keep writing. And as I said, my goal was always that this would be a series. So my hope is that my next book will be a continuation of Detective Emmett Corbin on his next adventure. And that's likely to be with Penguin again, as things stand right now, which will be fantastic. As far as, mediums and things go, I'm very traditional with my writing. I quite literally just have my laptop and I use my Word document, and that's it, and that's all I do. I'm really not very brave when it comes to trying different programs and different technologies. I am still a bit of a pen and paper girl too, I must say. Like I really love jotting my thoughts down just in a diary or in a notepad as I walk around, and then later on putting it all down on the computer. So I don't think that's going to change for me too much. But certainly the ability to move around a bit more is going to be helpful, because I do like actually going to the places that I write about and chatting to locals, and going into the local stores just to really get a feel for the place. And that will obviously be a lot easier once all these restrictions ease.
Some interesting stories, I bet, that you've heard when you go and talk to local people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really enjoy that. And I do think that's one thing that journalism has taught me, is that it's quite okay to walk up to strangers and just start having a chat. I think sometimes people don't do that enough. And certainly I've had other writers ask me, how do I go about asking police, for information, or how do I ask this? And I sort of say, look, there's no, we don't have any sort of special privileges as a reporter. We literally just walk up to people and start talking, and you can do that too. And you learn so much when you talk to neighbours and witnesses and locals and, the person behind the milk bar counter. And I really like doing that, because you often find really fascinating stories about the area that you really wouldn't know if you just wandered around on your own.
True, very true, very true. Catherine, do you think that crime and issues surrounding our criminal justice system have taken a backseat during the pandemic?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I was reading some data just the other day that showed that crime generally has gone down. But of course, on the other hand, domestic violence has really gone up. So it's interesting. I think there's sort of what you would call petty crime, or there's just less people out on the street. So you're not necessarily getting the fights and the brawls and the robberies that perhaps otherwise you might get, because everyone is at home. But then the rise in domestic violence and these sort of crimes really bother me, because, it sort of signals perhaps a deeper issue that's been, sitting there the entire time, that's come to a bit of a head with everyone feeling a bit of anxiety and stress.
Yeah, I tend to agree there. It's another upsetting and disturbing thing to say, but it is true. And I do hope that people get the help they need when they need it. So,
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really difficult conversation. I mean, so is the whole, violence against women and all this sort of thing. It's a really tough conversation. But again, like we were saying earlier, it's something I think we need to keep having, because it clearly is prevalent in society, and it does happen quite literally behind closed doors. So if we don't talk about it, people perhaps don't feel that they can reach out and get the help they need. And at a time like this, when we are all feeling a bit unsettled and uncertain, and people have lost their jobs and all the rest of it, it's really important that people feel okay to reach out for help.
very true. I totally agree with you there. Catherine, what has it been like to have a debut novel come out in the midst of a pandemic, and how have you adapted to your expectations around this?
Well, of course, initially I was a bit disappointed, because I really was looking forward to, getting around the country and meeting people and having a chat and going to all the bookstores, and particularly having a real book launch. I was really looking forward to having, this sort of group of people who've really helped me through this whole way in the same room, and I could celebrate with them and also thank them in person. Of course, none of that has happened, so that's been a little bit disappointing. But at the same time, it's really put things in perspective for me, the pandemic, and I realize how lucky I am to not only still have my job, but to have a book out in the world, which, has been a goal and a dream of mine for so many years. And it does seem to be doing reasonably well. And what I'm really quite humbled by is that people seem very keen at the moment to support Australian products and Australian industry. And it's been wonderful that that seems to be extending to Australian authors too. It's really been quite humbling, the amount of support I've got, particularly because I am a debut author and no one knows who I am, and I'm, very new to it all, that people are prepared to support me and take a chance and give the book a go. And yeah, the reviews and the feedback, it's been really wonderful so far.
Well, hopefully, when Detective Emmett Corbin comes back, we can do a book launch for you. So, and then people that have missed out on reading Sticks and Stones will be able to read your first book and your second book at the same time. So, that would be great. That's something to look forward to.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. And that's the other thing, you sort of touched on it there, and you're right that the book doesn't fade away just because, it didn't get the big launch it might have had. at the time. In a year's time, if there's book number 2, you're right, it might actually spur people on who haven't had a chance to go back and read book 1. So books are wonderful things because they don't just disappear. So they do have a long shelf life, quite literally.
Absolutely,
Mm.
absolutely. And me working in a library, they do have a long shelf life, I can tell you that for sure. Catherine, one last question. Because I work in a library, I'm curious, and I'm sure listeners out there are curious too. What are you reading at the moment? What are you listening to?
I've actually just started Gathering Dark by Candace Fox. I'm generally a really big Scandinavian crime lover and I read all the Scandi crime, but I'm a little bit the same at the moment that I really want to be supporting Australian writers and Australian publishers. So I've made a conscious decision to try and read Australian for the rest of the year as much as I can. And I'm loving all the new Candace Fox. I mean, I always love her style of writing. She has a very distinct, quirky way of developing characters, and certainly it's not a traditional crime novel, this one, but I'm really enjoying it so far. And then I'm also looking forward to Benjamin Stevenson's new one, which I think comes out in September. So I am certainly making a concerted effort to support Australian writers at the moment.
That's great. That's great. That's been wonderful. Thank you, Catherine, for your time and for a wonderful chat. We do wish you all the best with your new book, Sticks and Stones, and with all future publications. If you would like to purchase Catherine's book, please visit Booktopia online or call your favourite bookstore and they should be able to order it in for you. Bye, everyone, and thank you for listening. And look out for our upcoming digital content through the Inner West Library What's On and social media channels. Inner West Council Libraries have an extensive crime fiction and true crime collection. Be sure to check them out next time you visit. Bye, and thank you very much, Catherine.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.